Well, last week on the program, we spoke with the federal opposition spokesman on climate change and energy, Ted O'Brien, about this debate around his side of politics embracing nuclear energy as part of our suite of power sources. Everyone thinks it makes sense. Now, without saying it, I think Ted O'Brien made it pretty clear that going to an election with a nuclear option is still now a live choice. But I still wonder whether, when push comes to shove, the Dutton team will actually have the courage to do it. The issue will be polled heavily, and you'll get a sense, I get a sense anyway, that younger Australians have been poisoned against the idea, with the education system concentrating on older post-war technology and talking about accidents like Chernobyl. As dreadful as they were, that technology was so old. One young Australian who doesn't think like that is Will Shackel. He's the teenage leader of the group Nuclear for Australia, and he joins us again. Welcome, nice to speak with you again. Do you think the opposition will have the courage to go to an election with this policy?
Well, I certainly hope so, but I think the really important thing, Steve, is that all sides of politics embrace nuclear energy. We know that if we want to have a sustainable nuclear power industry anywhere around the world, you need bipartisan support. So not only is it about the coalition stepping up and listening to the experts and embracing nuclear energy and working to lift the bans, but it's also on the federal Labor government and independents to also realise that if they want to address the energy and climate issues in Australia, then they cannot do it without nuclear power.
Will, you and I have spoken before. I love your optimism, I love your passion and your enthusiasm, but there doesn't appear to be anybody that I can see within the broader Labor movement, certainly no one within the Greens, who want to embrace nuclear.
I think it's probably a bit different because obviously it's a very, very polarising debate. So it'd take a very, very, very brave individual to stand up and say that they supported nuclear. And that's what we're ultimately looking for, is individuals, politicians who put the interests of the Australian people, that put the interests of young people like me before their political colours, and decide that, you know, if they want to achieve their emissions targets and if they want the lights to stay on. Obviously, we've seen some issues in Victoria recently where the energy security has really come into question. Obviously, we're not on track to reach our emissions targets. If those politicians are really, really serious about what they are preaching for, then it's just definite that they're going to have to support our efforts to lift the bans. And that's really just the first step. It takes very, very little for a politician to put their hand up and say that they support the bans on nuclear energy being lifted. We should be able to have all energy options being considered in Australia, as every single other country around the world is able to. Australia is the only member of the G20 with a ban on nuclear energy. We're out of step with the rest of the world. And if we want to have a pragmatic approach to our energy transition and be able to get to net zero, then the only way to do that is by at very least considering the role for nuclear energy.
I must say I agree with you. I've told you that before. I don't want any names, but have anyone from the Labor side of politics or even, you know, a Green reached out to you on the quiet and said, keep going, young fella?
So I've spoken to people in the Greens and also in Labor, and I think that there's a very large juxtaposition between the rhetoric which we hear, which is, you know, very anti-nuclear, and the actual sentiment that exists. And I'm aware that, you know, there are people within the Greens. Certainly there are people, and I've got friends who are within the Young Greens and Young Labor who will support nuclear energy. And the fact is that a majority of Labor supporters actually support nuclear energy. We saw that in a recent poll launched at the start of the year. So when you look at people on the ground, what the grassroots actually think, it's very, very clear that a majority of Australians support nuclear energy. And I think it would be really unsurprising to me if it turned out that there would be Labor politicians and also independents and members of the Greens who also thought the same way, but were perhaps too scared to dissent, because obviously it's just such an emotional debate at the moment. And obviously, I think we can all predict it's going to get much, much more emotional and divisive as we continue with this debate over the course of the year and years to come.
Yeah, we can only hope those that are keeping it quiet have the courage to come out. I mentioned education in my intro, William, and the myths around nuclear and what youngsters like yourself were taught at school. I would be right in saying that you probably were taught things like, you know, how dreadful Chernobyl was, and that we shouldn't have nuclear because we can have another Chernobyl, ignoring the fact that the technology has improved incredibly.
I would slightly disagree in terms of that characterisation. I just wasn't taught about nuclear power in general in school. And there are some schools where you're not actually allowed to, a teacher is not allowed to teach their students about nuclear power. And that's for, a variety of reasons. And I think that's a really terrible thing, that it took me doing my own research, doing, 2 school assignments for me to discover what nuclear power actually was. And when you compare that to what we're taught about other energy sources, obviously we're told stuff about fossil fuels. Obviously we're told a lot about renewables. And it really, it makes a really messy situation where there is not enough nuclear literacy in this country. But what I'm able to see in terms of my peers is that when, they're exposed to the facts and information about nuclear power, the evidence of how it's been able to lower emissions and increase energy security around the world in the 32 countries that currently have nuclear power, that young people can be some of the strongest proponents for nuclear power. So I think that's a really, really important thing. I think because I think there's a difference where older generations, they have been exposed to the scare stories about Chernobyl, where the science has been put out of context. So I think there is a difference there. I would just, in a broad summary, say that young people just aren't taught about nuclear power, period.
Just finally, William, how's your petition going? And if there are people watching us on Sky tonight, where can they sign it?
So we've started the largest petition for nuclear power to be legalised in Australia ever. It's currently got close to 20,000 signatures. So I'd encourage your viewers, if they support nuclear energy, or at least support an all options on the table approach to our energy transition, to please sign and share our petition at nuclearforaustralia.com/petition or via one of our social media pages. That is the only way we're going to be able to keep the pressure up on government and hopefully get some politicians to come out in support of nuclear power, so we can finally see a nuclear power industry at some point in Australia, so we can have a long-term investment in terms of addressing our energy, national and climate security through using nuclear power.
You're an outstanding young man, William Shackel. Thank you for giving us some time tonight.
Thanks for having me on.